Author discussion on Booker T. Washington by Kelsey McCumber. Booker T. Washington was born in Franklin County, Virginia in 1856 from a white father he never met and an enslaved mother. Several years later, in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was put into effect. Washington and his family, now ex-slaves, moved to Malden, West Virginia, where Washington began working laborers' jobs and attending night school. He continued to pursue education and graduated with honors from Hampton Institute in 1875. He then worked for the school until establishing the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in 1881. He spent his remaining 34 years maintaining this institute and promoting his philosophy of African American education and socioeconomic progress. This promotion took many literary forms, including his public speeches and his autobiographies, like The Story of My Life and Work and Up from Slavery. So who was Booker T. Washington? He was a post-bellum African-American writer, orator, teacher, and civil rights activist with a humble and passionate mind. One of the readings included the Atlanta Exposition Address. So to start, what was the Atlanta Exposition? The Atlanta Exposition, also known as the Cotton States and International Exposition, was a large event designed to promote the American South to the world. So then, what was the Atlanta Exposition Address? This address was a speech given by Booker T. Washington, who was invited by President Grover Cleveland to speak on the behalf of the blacks. In this address, Washington wanted to cement the friendship of the races and bring about the hearty cooperation between the two. Washington begins by saying that a third of the South is African American, and therefore any businessman in the South, for instance, cannot be successful without acknowledging this information. From the beginning, he opens his eyes to the audience of a theme of acceptance. He just wants white men and women to give his race a chance to prove himself as patient, faithful, law-abiding, and unresentful people. African Americans have proven worthy of this acceptance because, as he shares, those African Americans have been the ones nursing your children and watching by the sick bed of your mothers and fathers. This evokes another theme, the theme of devotion that Washington employs as rationale for acceptance. He claims that African Americans are ready to lay down their lives, if need be, in defense of yours being the white man. Washington desires this unification of blacks and whites to be done trustingly and willingly, and not through aggressive coercion. He states this by saying, constant struggle rather than artificial forcing will eventually allow both sides harmony. Washington later revisits this theme of acceptance in a more critical manner by sharing that the facts as they are. If white men and women neglect his plan of acceptance, once 16 millions of hands that aid whites in pulling the upward will become 16 millions of hands that pull against whites. He blatantly shares that acceptance cannot be a choice, but a necessity towards growth and prosperity. Washington desires his kind to work aside the whites and not as rivals. This is incredible towards understanding Washington's character. He is a patient, educated man in support of peace. His experience in a slave hut through emancipation has shaped his understanding of the current issue. He has witnessed violence and its result and knows that no amount of uprising at the moment can solve the problem because what really needs to happen is a shift in white minds. True equality is not Washington's current goal, but he merely desires friendly interaction between the two races. A third theme I want to discuss is that what Washington originally states, friendship. The laws of changeless justice bind, oppressor with oppressed, and close as sin and suffering join, we march to fate abreast. He does not reject the distinctions made, oppressor white and oppressed black, but he full-heartedly believes that the two could live in each other's company. Combining both acceptance and friendship, Washington calls for his black neighbors to cast down their bucket. By this, he means for his fellow African Americans to accept the white man and befriend them, since this is the key to bettering their condition in a foreign land. This is remarkable for Washington to say. He wants his fellow black men to set aside hate for white men and courageously extend a hand in friendship. Washington wants African Americans to rise above their established opinions and resentment. He's not calling for sole white effort, since he knows that the perspective of the Southern whites will not be so easily altered. Following the speech in the textbook are several pages that Washington wrote of his collected thoughts, actions, and responses from others that he experienced after delivering his speech. Through this writing, we learn more about Washington's character, in particular his humbleness and dedication. His Atlanta Exposition Address was a giant success that led to many lecture job offers. In response to these opportunities, Washington said that whenever I spoke, it must be in the interest of the Tuskegee School and my race. At this point, he was well aware of his power as an orator and his popularity among all people, yet he remained faithful. He did not succumb to fame or fortune that followed these new positions, but remained loyal to his life's mission. Much of this humbleness probably stems from his childhood experiences as a slave and later as a 9-year-old in the coal mines. Nothing was ever freely given to him, whether it was as simple as food or as immense as social change. Washington knew that his words must provide the beginning of this progression. He knew his loyalty would not be so wrongfully inserted. Another fundamental part in Washington's response to his speech, previously mentioned, but more directly stated at the end of his piece, is the idea of growth among white men and women. It is important to remember that Booker T. Washington was invited to speak at the exposition. In a response, he notes, "I believe that the change in the direction I have indicated is going to happen." What did he indicate? Washington believes that one issue includes white minds set on blacks being foreigners or aliens will eventually change. He does not think that white growth towards acceptance and equality will be done through coercion, aggression, or protest because of the time in history this occurred. We must note that just a few years prior to this, slaves existed freely under law. They were bought and considered property. So for Washington to think radical movements would change these events would be absurd. He knew that baby steps were in order to prevent harsh regulations or a complete turnover to reoccur. This is backed up when Washington shares that if a black man demanded to speak at and represent the Atlanta Exposition, he would have been denied. However, since whites knew their authority and entitlement prevailed, they offered this invitation because it felt as a pleasure as well as a duty to reward the Negro race. In this, Washington indirectly attacks the white man through a misinterpreted compliment to somewhat get the minds of every person despite race headed towards this progression. Despite that, however, he knows complete submission is also too extreme. So to recap, aggression is bad, but nothing is equally bad. To make this distinction apparent, he continues after his speech hypothetical to state that he does not want his fellow black men to stop what they are doing. One example he provides is that he does not believe that the Negro should cease voting, and more importantly, should not cease to vote from principle, because in that they would lose the respect of the Southern white man. Trying to follow the whites or submit to the whites in a way that only follows white ideology cannot do anything but hurt their cause. Once again, both extremes are too extreme, and a happy medium, so to speak, is required to push in their direction while also not aggravating those in authority. All in all, Washington believes there must be participation from both sides. Blacks must accept whites and their currently rigid perspectives while still employing a happy medium effort towards change, and whites must accept blacks for their race towards equality. Additionally, these literary works begin to highlight some of the major personality traits of Booker T. Washington, including, but not limited to, his humbleness, passion, loyalty, and courage. In conclusion, Washington was a remarkable and intelligent man that served justice to be in the beginning, the journey to change.